There was a time when the world did not feel divided, not because it was peaceful or gentle, but because it did not yet have clear endings. No final coastline, no edge where the land simply stopped and became something else. The ground continued in every direction, stretching beyond the horizon, beyond the limits of a single lifetime. To move across it did not require crossing oceans or mastering unfamiliar waters. It required only time, memory, and the willingness to walk. Imagine standing on such a world, not imagining it as a map, but as a lived place. The sun rises and sets over land that seems endless. Rivers do not terminate at foreign seas but flow inward, feeding vast inland basins. Winds travel uninterrupted across thousands of miles, carrying the same dust, the same pollen, the same signals of season and change. The sky feels larger here, not because it is different, but because nothing interrupts the relationship between land and horizon. Before we go any further, take a moment if you like and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I always enjoy reading those comments, and it is quietly fascinating to see how these ideas travel across different places, late nights, early mornings, and everything in between. And as we continue, remember that the images you see here are simply meant to suggest a mood and a setting. Thank you, as always, for being here and for supporting this journey. In such a world, the idea of being far away would feel very different. Distance would not be measured in crossings, but in generations. The world would not be something you leave and arrive at. It would be something you gradually move through, one familiar landscape blending into the next. The notion of a place being unreachable would barely exist. There would be no natural barriers that clearly said, stop here, turn back, this is the end. This is the world of Pangea, not as a myth or a lost paradise, but as a geological reality. A single connected landmass that once gathered nearly all of Earth's continents into one continuous body. A world without edges in the way we understand them now. And this raises a quiet but unsettling question. If the world was once whole, how would civilization even begin? We are accustomed to imagining the birth of civilization in fragments, river valleys isolated by deserts, cultures separated by seas, peoples defined by borders, coastlines, and limits. Our history begins with separation already in place. We inherit a world where division is normal, where isolation shapes identity, and where connection requires effort, technology, and intention. But a world without edges changes the starting conditions entirely. In a connected world, movement is not an achievement, it is a given. Ideas do not need to be carried across dangerous gaps. They spread by proximity, by repetition, by shared survival. Knowledge does not belong to a place as much as it belongs to a path. And yet, if such a world existed, if its land allowed continuity rather than fragmentation, one mystery immediately follows. Why would it leave almost nothing behind? We do not find cities from such a time, no monuments clearly marking a first civilization that spanned a united world, no universal architecture, no unmistakable signature pressed into stone across continents. Instead, what we find is silence. A long stretch of prehistory that feels strangely empty, as though something fundamental is missing. This absence is often taken as proof that nothing was there. But absence can mean many things. It can mean destruction, it can mean erosion, or it can mean that whatever existed was never designed to remain. A civilization shaped for movement rather than permanence, for continuity rather than dominance, for adaptation rather than display. If the first civilization emerged on a world without edges, it may not have needed to announce itself. It may not have built in ways that demanded to be remembered. It may have been optimized not for endurance in stone, but for survival in time. This is where we must slow down. Because the question is not whether a city once stood on Pangaea. That is the wrong question. Cities belong to a world that has already been divided, a world where people must anchor themselves because connection is fragile. The deeper question is this: what kind of civilization would emerge on a world that did not yet know separation? And what happens to such a civilization when the ground itself begins to drift apart? At first, nothing would feel different. The land would not break overnight. There would be no sudden collapse, no single moment of loss. The world would simply begin to change in ways too slow to notice within a lifetime. Paths would lengthen. Familiar routes would become unreliable. The effortless continuity of movement would quietly erode. And with it, something else would begin to fade. Memory. Not memory as stories or myths, but memory as lived understanding. The shared sense of how the world fits together. The instinctive knowledge that beyond the next horizon lies not an ending, but more of the same world. If civilization once emerged in such a state, its disappearance would not look like a fall. It would look like forgetting. And that is why the first civilization, if it belonged to a whole world, might be so difficult to find. Not because it never existed, but because it existed before the world learned how to break itself into pieces. Pause here. Before we speak of timelines, or geology, or evidence, it is important to sit with this idea: a civilization shaped by connection rather than borders, by continuity rather than walls, by movement rather than settlement. Because once we understand the kind of world Pangaea was, we can begin to understand what kind of civilization it could allow, and why, when that world finally split apart, so little of that civilization was meant to remain. Before we go any further, something must be made clear. Pangaea was not a forgotten age of humanity. It was not a lost golden era where humans built cities across a single supercontinent and then vanished. Modern humans did not walk the land of Pangaea. Homo sapiens emerged hundreds of millions of years later, long after that world had already begun to break apart. This matters, because the question we are asking is not whether humans lived on Pangaea, but what kind of world Pangaea created, and how that kind of world shapes the way civilization can emerge. Pangaea existed roughly between 335 million and 175 million years ago. During that time, nearly all of Earth's land was gathered into one connected mass, surrounded by a vast global ocean. This configuration was not stable in the way we often imagine stability. It was dynamic, slow-moving, constantly reshaping itself under pressures far beyond human time. Mountains rose where plates collided. Inland seas formed and vanished. Deserts expanded deep into the interior. Coastlines shifted, but always as part of a single system. The important detail is not the exact shape of Pangaea, but its consequence: connection. A connected landmass changes how life spreads. Plants do not need to cross oceans. Animals migrate without encountering impassable barriers. Ecosystems blend gradually rather than abruptly. Evolution moves sideways as much as it moves forward. And worlds like this leave a very different kind of record. In a fragmented world, isolation produces sharp distinctions. Species diverge rapidly. Cultures differentiate. Technologies become localized. In a connected world, variation still exists, but it spreads, overlaps, and softens. Differences do not disappear, but they rarely remain confined. This principle applies not only to biology, but to behavior. When humans finally appear much later in Earth's history, they inherit a planet that still carries the consequences of that ancient connectedness. Land bridges linger. Climate systems retain long memories. Migration routes remain etched into geography, even after the continents have separated. This is why early human dispersal appears so rapid and so complete. Within a relatively short span of time, humans spread across nearly every continent, not because they suddenly became exceptional navigators, but because the planet still offered pathways shaped by deep geological history. What looks like remarkable expansion is often the reuse of ancient roots. So when we ask whether a first civilization could emerge in a connected world, we are not asking about humans on Pangaea itself. We are asking whether the conditions created by such a world could shape the earliest patterns of human organization later on. Civilization does not appear fully formed. It does not begin with stone cities or written records. It begins with shared habits, with repeated solutions to recurring problems, with ways of living that are passed on not because they are impressive, but because they work. A world defined by connection favors continuity over isolation. Knowledge spreads quietly. Techniques converge. Survival strategies align. Over long periods of time, this creates a shared foundation that does not belong to any one place. This is why the absence of ancient global monuments is not surprising. If the earliest forms of civilization emerged as patterns of movement, cooperation, and memory, rather than as permanent settlements, then they would leave behind very little that could fossilize into history. Stone survives. Habits do not. And when the land itself begins to fragment, those habits fragment with it. The separation of continents does not erase civilization. It changes its expression. What was once fluid becomes fixed. What once travelled becomes local. What once existed as shared understanding becomes regional tradition. From this moment onward, civilization becomes visible to archaeology. Cities appear. Walls rise, monuments are built, writing is invented, not because humanity suddenly becomes capable of these things, but because the world now demands permanence. When connection is no longer guaranteed, memory must be stored in stone and symbol. This is the mistake we often make. We assume that what is visible is what came first, but visibility is often a response to loss. If the first civilization emerged under conditions that did not require permanence, then it would not leave the kind of evidence we expect. It would leave echoes rather than ruins. And this is why the question is not who lived on Pangaea. The question is what kind of world Pangaea created, and how the long shadow of that world may still shape the beginnings of human civilization long after the supercontinent itself was gone. Only once we understand civilization as a process rather than a place can we begin to see how something so foundational could exist without leaving clear remains. And that is where we turn next. When we think about civilization, the images that come to mind are almost always physical. We picture stone walls rising from the ground, carefully planned streets, monuments designed to outlast generations, and cities that announce their presence through scale and permanence. Over time, these images have become so closely tied to the idea of civilization that it feels unnatural to separate the two. Yet this association tells us far more about how civilization ends up being recorded than about how it actually begins. Civilization does not begin with architecture. It begins with coordination. It begins when survival stops being a series of isolated reactions and becomes a shared system of understanding. Long before the first stones were stacked into walls, people were already organizing themselves around repeated solutions to recurring problems. They learned when to move, where to gather, how to read changes in the sky, how to manage resources across time rather than from one moment to the next. These patterns were not written down or carved into rock, but they were remembered, practiced, and passed forward with enough consistency to bind groups together across generations. In a world shaped by connection rather than isolation, permanence is not a priority. Heavy structures restrict movement, and fixed settlements assume that conditions will remain stable long enough to justify staying in one place. But environments influenced by long climate cycles, shifting resources, and gradual geological change reward flexibility instead. In such settings, a civilization optimized for survival would invest less in what lasts and more in what adapts. Knowledge would be stored in habits rather than buildings, and tools would be designed to be remade rather than preserved. Social systems would emphasize cooperation and memory rather than hierarchy and control. This is where modern assumptions begin to fail. Archaeology is designed to recover what does not move. It is exceptionally good at finding walls, foundations, and objects meant to endure, but it struggles to detect cultures whose primary achievements were behavioral rather than material. A civilization centered on movement, shared knowledge, and repeated practice could be highly sophisticated while leaving behind almost nothing recognizable to later observers. Its complexity would exist in timing, coordination, and continuity rather than in structures that resist decay. If we imagine how much of the modern world would disappear without written records or durable materials, the scale of this invisibility becomes easier to grasp. Languages, music, systems of navigation, and even advanced forms of cooperation would vanish with little trace. What remained would give a distorted picture, suggesting simplicity where there was organization and absence where there was continuity. The same distortion applies when we look deep into prehistory and expect early civilization to announce itself through monuments. A connected world like Pangea would naturally encourage this kind of civilization. When land stretches continuously and movement does not require technological leaps, ideas spread gradually rather than abruptly. Knowledge converges across regions because there are no hard barriers to prevent it. Over time, this produces shared patterns that feel universal without ever being centralized. There would be no single origin point, no capital city, and no defining structure that history could later point to as the beginning. Civilization would exist as a distributed process rather than a fixed location. This is why the earliest visible civilizations appear so suddenly once the world begins to fragment. As land masses separate and familiar routes degrade, continuity becomes fragile. Knowledge that once traveled easily now risks being lost, and memory can no longer rely solely on movement and repetition. In response, humans begin to anchor their understanding in place. Architecture emerges as a way to stabilize meaning, writing appears as a way to preserve shared knowledge, and cities form as nodes where memory can be stored rather than carried. Seen this way, the rise of permanent settlements does not mark the birth of civilization, but a transformation forced by changing conditions. It is the moment when civilization is compelled to stop moving. What comes before that moment does not vanish because it was weak or undeveloped, but because it was never designed to be seen through stone and ruin. It belonged to a world where continuity mattered more than endurance, and where survival depended on adaptation rather than display. If the first civilization emerged under such conditions, then its traces would not be found in the ground as monuments, but along paths that no longer exist. To understand it, we must stop searching for places and begin paying attention to processes, because the earliest forms of civilization were not built to remain. They were built to move. In a world without clear edges, connection is not something that must be achieved. It is simply the natural state of existence. When land extends continuously and familiar terrain fades gradually rather than ending abruptly, movement becomes an extension of daily life rather than an extraordinary act. People do not think in terms of crossing into unknown worlds. They move outward slowly, following water, seasons, animals, and resources, carrying their understanding with them as they go. Over time, the land itself teaches continuity, because nothing signals that one region belongs to a fundamentally different world than the next. This has profound consequences for how societies form. In fragmented landscapes, separation creates identity. Oceans, deserts, and mountains divide groups long enough for their traditions, languages, and technologies to harden into distinct forms. In a connected world, that hardening process is constantly interrupted. Differences still arise, but they spread before they can fully isolate. Ideas circulate, merge, and adjust, producing a shared foundation that stretches across vast distances without requiring centralized control. Such a world does not encourage sharp boundaries. It encourages gradients. Customs change gradually. Tools evolve in parallel. Knowledge adapts to local conditions while remaining recognizable elsewhere. There is no sudden sense of entering foreign territory, only the slow realization that certain details have shifted. In this way, connection becomes invisible, precisely because it is everywhere. It does not announce itself. It simply works. This stands in stark contrast to the world we inherit today. Modern civilization is shaped by separation that already exists. We learn history through borders, coastlines, and divisions that feel permanent. We assume that connection must be built through ships, roads, and networks, because without them, the world naturally fragments. But this assumption reflects our circumstances, not a universal rule. On a supercontinent like Pangaea, connection would not have been an achievement. It would have been the background condition. Movement would not have required innovation, only endurance. Communication would not depend on systems designed to overcome barriers, because the barriers themselves were limited. The flow of people and ideas would have been slower than modern travel, but far more continuous, unfolding across generations rather than across voyages. This continuity reshapes how memory functions. In a connected world, knowledge does not need to be preserved against isolation. It remains alive through repetition and shared experience. What one group learns does not stay confined long enough to become uniquely theirs. It moves, adapts, and returns altered but familiar. Over long periods of time, this creates a sense of shared understanding that does not rely on written records or monuments. Yet this state is fragile in a way that is difficult to perceive from within it. Because change happens slowly, it does not feel like loss. When the land begins to stretch and shift, when familiar routes lengthen and climates subtly diverge, the effects are measured in lifetimes rather than moments. No single generation experiences the world breaking apart. Each simply adapts to slightly different conditions than the one before. This is how separation truly begins. Not with catastrophe, but with inconvenience. Paths that once connected easily become longer. Seasonal movements require more planning. Communication weakens at the edges. Over time, connection stops being automatic and starts requiring intention. What was once the default quietly becomes effortful. And with that shift, something important changes. When connection is no longer guaranteed, knowledge becomes vulnerable. Memory that once travelled freely now risks fading. The shared patterns that defined early civilization begin to fragment, not because they fail, but because the world no longer supports them in the same way. This is the turning point that is easy to overlook. Civilization does not collapse when the land begins to divide. It adapts. But adaptation comes with a cost. To preserve what can no longer move easily, people begin to fix it in place. The earliest steps toward permanence are not driven by ambition, but by necessity. Understanding this moment is essential because it explains why the first visible civilizations emerge only after the world has already changed. They are not the beginning of human organization, but a response to the slow erosion of connection that once made such structures unnecessary. And as the land continues its quiet drift, the world that once felt whole begins to forget that it ever was. In a connected world, movement does not belong to individuals so much as it belongs to time. No single person walks the length of the land, and no lifetime contains the full scale of the world. Instead, distance is crossed gradually, through the accumulated motion of many generations. One group settles for a time, adapts to local conditions, and then shifts slightly as resources change. Their children inherit not only the land beneath their feet, but the direction of travel itself. Over centuries, these small movements link together into vast trajectories that no one ever experiences in full. This is how a world without edges is explored. not through conquest or exploration in the modern sense, but through continuity. Routes are not planned in advance or drawn as lines on a map. They emerge from repetition. A valley that offers reliable water becomes familiar. A seasonal passage that avoids extreme heat is remembered. Over time, these paths become embedded in collective behavior, passed down through practice rather than instruction. Movement becomes memory, and memory becomes geography. Such migration does not feel like expansion from within. To those living it, it feels like maintenance. Groups return to places their ancestors once used, or follow routes described through stories and shared experience. Each generation inherits a world that is already known, even if it has never been fully seen. The land beyond the horizon is not foreign, it is simply not yet encountered. In this way, civilization spreads without ever needing to define itself as a spreading force. Knowledge moves with people, but it does not arrive all at once. It arrives in fragments, adjusted to new environments and refined by local experience. A technique for managing water, a way of reading seasonal signs, or a method of tool-making might travel hundreds of miles over many lifetimes, changing slightly with each transfer while retaining its core logic. This slow diffusion produces a shared foundation across wide regions. Different groups may express it differently, but they recognize one another through familiar patterns of behavior. Cooperation becomes possible not because everyone is the same, but because the differences are variations rather than divisions. There is no need for formal trade networks or diplomatic structures because interaction is built into the rhythm of movement itself. In such a system, memory does not reside in records or symbols. It resides in roots. The land becomes a living archive, marked not by monuments, but by usage. Campsites reused over centuries, pathways worn gradually into the landscape, seasonal gathering points where knowledge is exchanged, relationships are renewed, and collective understanding is reinforced. These places may leave little behind for archaeology, but they anchor civilization just as effectively as cities would later do. Over time, this mode of existence shapes how people think about the world. Identity is not tied to fixed borders or permanent settlements. It is tied to participation in a shared pattern. Belonging comes from knowing when to move, where to pause, and how to read the signals of change. The world feels coherent because it is navigable, not because it is controlled. This is why the idea of a first civilization spanning a connected world does not require centralized authority or monumental expression. Its cohesion would come from continuity rather than command, from memory rather than enforcement, from shared movement rather than fixed institutions. But this balance depends on one critical condition. The land must remain predictable enough for roots to endure. When the ground itself begins to shift, even slowly, the relationship between movement and memory starts to strain. Paths lengthen. Familiar crossings become unreliable. What was once passed down effortlessly now requires conscious preservation, and when movement can no longer carry memory on its own, civilization must begin to change how it remembers. A world without edges is not a gentle world. While the connected land of Pangaea allowed continuity, its interior imposed conditions that were often extreme. Far from moderating oceans, vast inland regions experienced sharper temperature shifts, longer dry seasons, and greater variability from year to year. Rain did not arrive evenly, and resources were rarely stable. Survival in such environments required attention, memory, and cooperation, rather than force or dominance. Life in the interior demanded an intimate understanding of cycles. Water sources appeared and disappeared. Rivers shifted their courses. Winds carried signals of approaching change long before storms arrived. To live well in such a place, people had to learn how to read subtle cues in the land and sky, and to act on them collectively. Individual strength mattered far less than shared awareness. Those who failed to coordinate did not simply struggle, they vanished. These pressures did not prevent the development of civilization, they refined it. Knowledge became the most valuable resource because it allowed groups to anticipate change rather than react to crisis. Remembering where water could be found during extreme seasons, understanding when to move to avoid heat or cold, and knowing how to preserve food across uncertain intervals all required systems of shared learning that extended beyond individual experience. In such conditions, cooperation was not an ethical ideal, it was a practical necessity. Groups that coordinated movement, shared labour, and distributed resources survived longer than those that did not. Over time, this reinforced social structures built around trust and repetition rather than hierarchy. Authority emerged through reliability rather than control. Those who remembered accurately and acted consistently became central, not because they commanded others, but because others depended on them. The interior world also shaped how people thought about permanence. When environments change unpredictably, building for eternity is a liability. Structures that cannot be abandoned become traps. Tools and shelters were designed to be effective but temporary, easily repaired or replaced rather than preserved. This choice was not a limitation of capability, but an expression of environmental intelligence. The land rewarded those who could leave without loss. This way of living encouraged a form of sophistication that is often overlooked. Precision in timing, subtlety in observation, and restraint in resource use are not primitive skills. They require long memory and collective discipline. A group that can move at the right moment, conserve energy during scarcity, and reorganize itself without collapse demonstrates a high degree of social coordination, even if it leaves little material evidence behind. As generations adapted to these conditions, civilization became increasingly embedded in behavior rather than objects. Knowledge was carried in stories, routines, and shared expectations. Children learned not only skills, but judgment. They learned when not to act, when to wait, and when to leave. These lessons were reinforced not by law or punishment, but by the visible consequences of misreading the land. This is the kind of civilization that thrives in harsh worlds, one that values foresight over accumulation, flexibility over dominance, and continuity over display. It is not designed to impress, but to endure through change. Its success is measured not in monuments, but in survival across uncertainty. Yet even such systems depend on stability at a deeper level. When environmental pressures intensify beyond familiar limits, or when the land itself begins to reconfigure, the balance between movement and memory is tested. The strategies that once worked effortlessly begin to strain, and the need to preserve knowledge in new ways becomes unavoidable. This is where adaptation must evolve again, not because the old ways failed, but because the world no longer behaves as it once did. In a connected world shaped by movement, knowledge does not belong to a location. It belongs to people, and more importantly, to the patterns they repeat as they move. Ideas do not spread through formal teaching or centralized instruction, but through observation, imitation, and gradual refinement. A method that works in one place is carried elsewhere, tested against new conditions, and adjusted rather than discarded. Over time, this process creates convergence, not because groups are copying one another deliberately, but because they are solving similar problems within a shared framework. This kind of knowledge is remarkably resilient. It does not depend on preservation in objects or texts, and it does not require continuous contact between distant groups. Once learned, it can survive long periods of separation, re-emerging in altered forms when conditions allow. Techniques for managing fire, shaping tools, or organizing labor may appear independently across wide regions, not as coincidences, but as echoes of a shared inheritance shaped by long continuity. Fire offers a clear example. The ability to maintain fire across seasons requires planning, coordination, and restraint. Groups that mastered this skill passed it forward not as a single technique, but as a set of habits surrounding care, timing, and responsibility. These habits travelled with people, embedding themselves into daily life so deeply that they no longer felt like knowledge at all, but like instinct. When such practices reappear far apart in time and space, they are often mistaken for separate inventions, when in reality they may reflect the survival of a much older pattern. The same is true of tools. Basic forms converge because materials and needs converge, but refinement reflects memory. The way a blade is shaped, a handle balanced, or a tool repaired rather than replaced reveals an accumulated understanding that extends beyond immediate necessity. These choices carry information about mobility, resource scarcity, and cooperation, even when the objects themselves decay. In a world where movement is continuous, knowledge rarely remains isolated long enough to become fixed. It circulates until it feels natural, and because it feels natural, it is rarely marked as special. There is no sense of invention, only of doing things the way they have always been done. This makes such knowledge difficult to trace because it leaves no clear starting point and no obvious end point. What persists instead is memory, not memory as story, but as practice, the repeated action that reinforces itself over time. The shared expectation that certain things will be done in certain ways, not because they are commanded, but because they are known to work. Civilization, in this sense, is a living system that exists only as long as it is enacted. As the world begins to fragment, this form of knowledge faces a new challenge. When roots stretch and contact weakens, the circulation of ideas slows. What was once reinforced through repeated encounter must now survive longer periods of isolation. Some knowledge adapts and becomes localized. Other elements fade, not because they are wrong, but because the conditions that supported them no longer exist. Yet even in fragmentation, echoes remain. Similar solutions appear in distant places. Shared structures emerge without clear lines of transmission. These patterns puzzle modern observers, who search for direct contact or migration routes to explain them. Often, what they are seeing is not the result of recent exchange, but the persistence of an older continuity that has been stretched thin rather than erased. This is why the earliest visible civilizations appear both distinct and strangely familiar. Their differences reflect local adaptation, while their similarities point to a deeper shared past. Knowledge that could once move freely now survives in fragments, preserved unevenly across a world that no longer supports effortless connection. And as separation deepens, memory begins to change its form. What can no longer travel easily must find another way to endure. When we look back toward the deepest layers of human history, the silence can feel unsettling. We expect beginnings to announce themselves, to leave clear traces that mark a first step or a defining moment. Instead, what we encounter is an extended absence, a long stretch of time where evidence appears sparse, scattered, or entirely missing. This absence is often interpreted as proof that nothing significant existed, but that conclusion rests on an assumption that importance must leave durable remains. In a world shaped by movement rather than settlement, durability is not a primary concern. Structures meant to last restrict flexibility, and objects designed for permanence become burdens when conditions demand relocation. For societies adapted to continuous movement, building lightly and temporarily is not a limitation of skill, but an expression of intelligence. Materials are chosen for availability and ease of replacement rather than endurance. What matters is not how long an object lasts, but how easily it can be recreated when needed. Nomadic and semi-nomadic lifeways leave behind a different kind of record. Camps are reused rather than monumentalized. Paths are maintained through repetition rather than construction. Knowledge is preserved through action rather than inscription. These traces blur into the landscape over time, especially when later environments overwrite them through erosion, sedimentation, and geological change. What remains is often indistinguishable from natural processes. This creates a profound mismatch between how early civilization may have functioned and how we attempt to detect it. Archaeology excels at finding what was meant to stay in one place. It struggles to identify systems that were designed to move, adapt, and disappear without loss. The absence of large-scale structures does not imply the absence of organization. It implies a different relationship with permanence. Habit, unlike stone, does not fossilize easily. A shared way of doing things can persist for thousands of years without leaving a clear physical signature. Seasonal movement patterns, methods of resource sharing, and collective decision-making can survive across generations while leaving behind only faint material traces. When these habits finally fade, they do so quietly, without collapse or ruin. The irony is that what endures best is often not what was most important. Stone survives because it resists decay, not because it was central to daily life. The most essential elements of early civilization, such as timing, coordination, and shared understanding, were carried within people rather than stored in objects. When those people moved on, little remained to mark their presence. As the land continues to fragment and climates shift, this invisibility increases. Rising seas erase coastal paths. Changing river systems bury campsites. Expanding deserts consume routes once travelled regularly. Each change removes another layer of evidence, not through destruction, but through transformation. The landscape forgets gradually, just as people do. This process explains why the archaeological record appears to begin abruptly. It is not that civilization suddenly emerges fully formed, but that its expression changes. When connection weakens, and memory can no longer rely on movement alone, people begin to fix their knowledge in place. Structures become heavier. Settlements become more permanent. The things that survive are the things built in response to loss. What we find then is not the start of civilization, but the moment it becomes visible because it can no longer remain fluid. And as fragmentation accelerates, the conditions that once allowed civilization to move freely begin to vanish altogether, setting the stage for a world where memory must find new forms if it is to endure. The separation of the world did not arrive as a single event. There was no moment when the land split open beneath human feet. No day when people looked out and realized that the world they knew was ending. Instead, the change unfolded so slowly that it remained invisible within a single lifetime. The ground shifted by distances too small to measure without reference points that did not yet exist. Coastlines crept outward. Inland seas widened. Familiar paths lengthened by degrees so subtle that they were felt only as inconvenience rather than loss. For generations, life continued much as it always had. People adapted without realizing that adaptation itself was becoming more difficult. Routes that once connected reliably now required longer journeys. Seasonal movements demanded greater precision. Encounters between distant groups grew less frequent, not because they were avoided, but because the land no longer supported them as easily. The world did not feel broken, only less responsive. This gradual weakening of connection had profound effects on memory. When movement reinforces shared understanding, repetition keeps knowledge alive. But as roots stretch and interactions thin, repetition becomes uneven. Some practices are reinforced locally, while others fade at the margins. What was once a shared pattern across a connected land begins to diverge, not through intention, but through isolation measured in time rather than space. The loss is not immediately recognized. Each group continues to operate effectively within its own environment, passing down what still works. The problem emerges only when knowledge that once traveled freely no longer arrives. Skills that depended on broader coordination begin to erode. Stories grow shorter. Explanations replace lived understanding. What was once known through participation becomes something remembered imperfectly. As this process continues, the world slowly stops feeling whole, not because people understand that continents are separating, but because their experience of continuity diminishes. The sense that beyond the next horizon lies more of the same world gives way to uncertainty. Familiarity becomes regional. Identity begins to attach itself to place rather than pattern. This shift alters how civilization organizes itself. When connection can no longer be assumed, it must be managed. People begin to settle more permanently, not out of preference, but out of necessity. Fixed locations offer predictability when movement grows unreliable. Memory that once traveled with people now needs anchors, places where it can be reinforced and protected. None of this feels like collapse. It feels like adaptation. The world demands different solutions, and civilization responds accordingly. But each response carries a cost. As knowledge becomes localized, the shared foundation that once linked distant groups weakens. The long continuity that defined early civilization thins until it exists only as fragments. What replaces it is silence between regions. Not total silence, but enough to allow divergence. Enough for similar problems to be solved differently, for shared habits to become distinct traditions, and for memory to shift from lived experience to inherited story. This is the true consequence of the ground beginning to drift. Not destruction, but disconnection. A slow turning inward that reshapes civilization from a continuous process into a collection of local histories. And once that silence settles in, it becomes difficult to remember that the world was ever whole at all. As the world continued to fragment, civilization began to change its shape. What had once existed as a continuous process, carried through movement and shared practice, now faced a different reality. Roots that once reinforced common understanding weakened, and knowledge that had travelled freely became increasingly confined to local regions. In response, people adapted not by abandoning civilization, but by reshaping how it was preserved. This is the moment when civilizations become visible to history. When continuity can no longer be maintained through movement alone, memory must be stabilized. Shared practices that once survived through repetition now require reinforcement through structure. Settlements grow more permanent, not because people suddenly desire fixed lives, but because permanence offers protection against forgetting. A place that endures can hold knowledge when people can no longer carry it easily. Cities emerge from this need. They are not the birthplace of civilization, but containers for it. Within them, memory can be organized, defended, and passed forward, even as connection to distant regions fades. Walls define space not as an expression of dominance, but as a means of preserving coherence in a world that no longer guarantees it. Laws replace shared understanding, rituals formalize what was once intuitive, and institutions take the place of patterns that previously sustained themselves. This shift also explains the sudden appearance of monuments and large-scale architecture. When knowledge is at risk of being lost, it is anchored in durable forms. Stone becomes a medium of memory because it resists decay longer than habit or story alone. Writing emerges for the same reason. What was once known through participation must now be recorded because participation no longer spans the same distances or timeframes. The result is a patchwork of civilizations that appear distinct and self-contained. Each develops its own traditions, symbols, and histories, shaped by local conditions and preserved within defined boundaries. From the perspective of later observers, these civilizations seem to arise independently, as if from nothing. Their sudden visibility creates the illusion of sudden origin. But what we are seeing is not the beginning of civilization. We are seeing its adaptation to separation. The shared foundation that once linked these societies has not vanished entirely. It survives in similarities that are often dismissed as coincidence or parallel development. Comparable social structures, recurring mythic themes, and convergent technologies reflect an older continuity that has been fractured rather than erased. Each civilization preserves a portion of that inheritance, reshaped by local needs and expressed through local forms. History, as it is written, begins here because this is where memory becomes fixed enough to leave a lasting record. The deeper past remains quiet not because it lacked complexity, but because it relied on forms of continuity that do not survive fragmentation. What endures are the systems designed to compensate for loss. Cities, then, are not monuments to human ambition alone. They are responses to a world that no longer supports effortless connection. They stand as evidence not of beginnings, but of transition. They mark the point where civilization must anchor itself in place to avoid dissolving altogether. Understanding this reframes how we view early history. The civilizations we can name and study are not isolated inventions. They are local expressions of something far older, shaped by a world that once allowed civilization to exist without walls, borders, or permanent centers. And as we move forward, we begin to see that what we call history is not the story of how civilization started, but the story of how it learned to remember itself when the world stopped being whole. When the shared continuity of the world fades, it does not disappear cleanly. What remains does not survive as history, but as impression, as repetition without explanation, as stories that feel older than their telling. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, similar themes emerge, not because they were copied directly, but because they descend from experiences that once belonged to a connected world. Floods appear again and again, not always as punishment, but as transition. A time when the familiar world was altered beyond recognition, when land was lost, roots vanished, and survival required adaptation to new boundaries. These stories do not read like inventions. They read like memory reshaped by distance. Details change, names shift, causes become symbolic, but the underlying sense of loss remains consistent. So too does the idea of a golden age. Many traditions speak of a distant past when life felt simpler, more ordered, and more connected. This is often dismissed as nostalgia or myth-making, but it may reflect something more specific, a time when the world itself allowed continuity, when movement reinforced shared understanding rather than threatening it, when civilization did not need to define itself against borders because borders were not yet dominant. As fragmentation deepened, memory adapted. What could no longer be maintained through lived experience was preserved through story. Explanation replaced participation. Events that once unfolded slowly across generations were compressed into moments, gods, or catastrophes. The complexity of change was simplified so it could survive transmission across increasingly isolated cultures. This process does not produce accuracy in the modern sense, it produces resonance. Myths persist because they capture the emotional truth of change rather than its mechanics. They preserve the feeling of a world becoming unfamiliar, of knowledge slipping out of reach, of something vast and shared breaking into pieces that no longer quite fit together. Even ancient maps hint at this deeper intuition. Early attempts to represent the world often show coastlines that seem oddly compatible, landmasses that appear designed to fit together. While these maps are frequently criticized for their inaccuracies, they may reflect more than guesswork. They may express a collective sense that the world was once unified, even if the means to demonstrate it scientifically did not yet exist. These echoes do not prove the existence of a specific lost civilization. They point instead to a shared inheritance of experience shaped by long continuity followed by gradual separation. They suggest that humanity carries a memory of wholeness that survives not as fact, but as orientation. A sense that the world was once navigable in ways it no longer is. This memory influences how civilizations interpret their own origins. Founding myths often describe descent from a unified source, a migration from a common homeland, or a time when humans and the world were in closer alignment. These narratives function less as records of events and more as attempts to reconcile present fragmentation with an inherited sense of unity. Over time, as histories harden and identities solidify, these echoes fade further into the background. They are reinterpreted, allegorized, or dismissed. Yet they persist because they answer a question that archaeology alone cannot. Why so many civilizations separated by vast distances seem to be remembering the same loss? If the world was once whole, and if civilization emerged within that wholeness, then the stories we tell are not about beginnings, but about separation. They are not accounts of creation, but reflections of fragmentation. They survive because they offer coherence in a world that no longer provides it naturally. These echoes are the last traces of a civilization that did not need to be recorded when it existed. They are not evidence in stone, but in pattern, and they point us toward a deeper understanding of why the past feels incomplete, not because it was empty, but because it belonged to a world that no longer exists. All that remains now is to consider what this understanding means for us, standing on a planet that is still changing beneath our feet. We began this journey by imagining a world without edges, a land that did not teach separation, where movement was not an act of courage or exploration, but a natural condition of life. In that world, continuity required no effort because the land itself provided it. That world no longer exists in physical form, yet its influence has not disappeared. The planet beneath our feet is still moving, still reshaping itself in ways too slow to feel, but powerful enough to redefine how civilizations emerge, organize, and remember. What we call the first civilizations are not true beginnings. They are responses. They arise at the moment when the world stops offering effortless connection, when shared memory can no longer rely on movement alone. Cities, monuments, and written histories are not signs of sudden intelligence or ambition. They are evidence of adaptation. They mark the point at which humanity learned to preserve what the land itself could no longer hold together. Seen from this perspective, the long silence before recorded history is not empty. It is quiet because it belonged to a different kind of world. A world where coordination mattered more than control, where cooperation emerged from necessity rather than authority, and where survival depended on reading change rather than resisting it. That civilization did not collapse in fire or flood. It faded as conditions shifted, leaving behind fragments rather than ruins. This understanding carries an important lesson. Civilization is not defined by what it builds, but by how it responds when the world changes. The structures we celebrate today often emerge not from confidence but from loss. They are tools designed to stabilize memory in a landscape that no longer supports continuity on its own. We live now in another moment of transition. Climate patterns are changing in ways that disrupt familiar cycles. Coastlines are retreating and advancing again. Migration is reshaping societies, not as an anomaly, but as a return to a very old pattern. At the same time, connection is being rebuilt through technology rather than geography. Information travels instantly, yet understanding often does not. We are more connected than ever, and yet more fragmented in how that connection is experienced. This contradiction mirrors the shift that occurred when the world first began to divide. Once again, humanity is adjusting to conditions it did not choose, within systems it inherited rather than designed. The challenges feel unprecedented because they are expressed through modern forms, but the underlying process is familiar. The ground changes and civilization adapts. The deeper lesson of a civilization shaped by a whole world is not an instruction to return to the past. It is a reminder of what allows systems to survive disruption. Flexibility mattered more than permanence. Shared knowledge mattered more than accumulation. The ability to move together, physically or conceptually, mattered more than the ability to dominate a fixed space. These principles were not moral ideals. They were survival strategies, In contrast, many modern systems are optimized for stability rather than adaptability. They assume predictable environments, fixed resources, and controlled boundaries. When those assumptions fail, the systems strain. What we experience today as crisis is often the moment when structures built for permanence are asked to behave like systems designed for change. If the first civilization emerged on a world that had not yet split apart, its greatest achievement may not have been technological or architectural. It may have been its relationship with uncertainty. That civilization learned to live within a planet that changed slowly but relentlessly, and it organized itself around memory, cooperation, and movement rather than control. Its legacy is not found in artifacts, but in patterns that reappear whenever humans face instability together. These patterns are visible today, in the return of decentralized networks, in the rediscovery of local knowledge, in the renewed importance of cooperation across boundaries that feel increasingly artificial. Even the way we think about progress is beginning to shift, away from endless expansion and toward resilience. The continents may have drifted, but the process has never stopped. The Earth remains dynamic, and civilization remains a response to that motion. Each era learns how to remember under new conditions. Sometimes memory is stored in stone, sometimes in text, sometimes in digital form, and sometimes, as before, it survives only through practice and shared understanding. This reframes the idea of a first civilization entirely. It is not something locked in the distant past, waiting to be uncovered. It is something that emerges whenever humans learn to adapt together to a changing world. It appears, dissolves, and reappears in different forms, shaped not by intention, but by circumstance. Perhaps this is why the idea of a first civilization feels both distant and familiar. It resonates not because we are remembering a specific place or time, but because we are recognizing a process we are still living through. The feeling of standing on shifting ground, the tension between connection and fragmentation, the challenge of carrying memory forward when continuity can no longer be assumed. The story then does not end with separation. It does not end with cities, or with history, or even with the present moment. It continues wherever humans respond to change by learning, cooperating, and adapting rather than resisting what cannot be held still. If this journey resonated with you, consider supporting the channel by liking the video, sharing it with someone who might enjoy these questions, or subscribing to continue exploring these forgotten layers of the past together. Your support allows these stories to keep unfolding, slowly and carefully, just as they were meant to. The world beneath our feet is still rearranging itself, and so, in quieter ways, are we.